The Road to Africa, Caesar's struggles, and the Pompeian threat. Julius Caesar had stood victorious on the battlefields of Iberia, Greece, Anatolia, and Egypt. His triumphs had reshaped the power structure of Rome, proving his unmatched military genius. The Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BC had been a decisive moment, forcing Pompey the Great to flee and leaving the remnants of the Pompeian faction scattered. But despite his victories, Rome was far from secure. Unrest simmered beneath the surface, and his enemies were gathering their strength in North Africa, determined to reclaim what they had lost. Caesar, ever the gambler, now faced one of his greatest challenges. After the Civil War, Rome was anything but stable. The war had left deep scars, both politically and economically. Caesar may have emerged as the dominant force, but his position was precarious. The Senate was divided, the aristocracy resentful, and many saw him as a tyrant who had dismantled the republic for his own gain. Even among his allies, there was growing discontent. His legions had fought tirelessly for years, many of them expecting land and riches in return for their service. However, the prolonged campaigns in the east had drained Rome's coffers. Caesar had personally spent vast amounts of his own fortune to maintain his legions, but it was not enough. Meanwhile, the remnants of the Pompeian faction had regrouped. While many had hoped that Pharsalus had marked the end of resistance, this was far from reality. Africa, with its vast resources and strategic location, became the new heart of Pompeian opposition. Here, a new army was being forged under the command of Cato and Scipio, prepared to challenge Caesar once more. Why did the Pompeians choose Africa as their stronghold? The answer lay in both history and geography. Africa had long been a critical region for Rome. It was not only a rich source of grain, but also a place where veteran legions could be easily raised and trained. It had been a key battleground during Rome's past conflicts, and now, once again, it would serve as the stage for another decisive war. The leadership of the Pompeian faction had shifted. Initially, Cicero had been approached to take command, but ever the orator and never the general, he declined, preferring to use his influence in the Senate. Instead, leadership fell to Cato and Scipio. Cato, a man of unshakable principles and fierce opposition to Caesar, was a natural successor to Pompey in ideology, if not in military experience. He had spent his life upholding the traditional values of the Republic and saw Caesar as its ultimate destroyer. However, his lack of battlefield prowess was a glaring weakness. To compensate, Metellus Scipio was appointed as the military commander. A seasoned politician and former consul, Scipio had experience, but was no military genius. His greatest strength was his name. The Scipios had a legendary history in Africa. The belief that no Scipio had ever been defeated in Africa was a powerful psychological weapon, one that they hoped would hold true against Caesar. Under their command, a formidable force was assembled. 14 legions, including battle-hardened veterans from previous defeats in Iberia and Greece, alongside for elite Numidian legions provided by King Juba. They had cavalry superiority and even war elephants, a terrifying sight on the battlefield. The Pompeians were ready to reclaim Rome. Back in Italy, Caesar faced an immediate crisis: money. The war had drained his financial reserves, and Rome's economy was in tatters. To fund his next campaign, he resorted to borrowing enormous sums from individuals and cities alike. He had no intention of repaying these debts. In his mind, they were a necessary price for victory, much like a tax imposed for the public good. However, this strategy came at a political cost. Many Romans saw it as another sign of Caesar's growing tyranny. Yet, money was only one of his problems. A greater threat came from within his own legions. For veteran legions stationed in Campania, men who had fought for him for over a decade, had mutinied. They had been promised land and payment after Pharsalus, yet here they were, still being called to war. Their patience had run out. The mutiny was serious. These were no ordinary soldiers. They were Caesar's most experienced men. They had looted wealthy estates, even killed two senators who had attempted to negotiate with them. Antony, left in charge in Caesar's absence, had failed to control them. If Caesar lost their loyalty now, his entire campaign could collapse before it even began. But Caesar knew his men better than anyone. Instead of suppressing the mutiny with force, he confronted them directly. In a brilliant psychological maneuver, he addressed them not as soldiers, but as thieves, citizens. He called their bluff, disbanding them on the spot, stating that they were free to leave but would receive their promised rewards only after his victory in Africa. The veterans, who had expected to pressure Caesar into granting them immediate rewards, were stunned. Their pride was wounded. They had not expected to be dismissed so easily. Realizing their mistake, they begged to be reinstated. Caesar, in a final act of control, allowed all but the 10th Legion, the very unit he had once favored, to rejoin his ranks. The 10th, humiliated, offered to undergo decimatio, the brutal Roman practice of executing 1 in every 10 men, to prove their loyalty. Caesar, feigning indifference, eventually allowed them back without punishment. His gamble had paid off. Without spending a single coin or shedding a drop of blood, he had regained the loyalty of his most dangerous troops. With his legions back under control, Caesar prepared for the invasion of Africa. 10 legions were ordered to assemble in Sicily. But there was one more challenge: the legend of the Scipios. Word had reached Caesar that many of his soldiers feared the old superstition that no Scipio could be defeated in Africa. Ever the master of psychological warfare, Caesar countered this by recruiting a minor member of the Scipio family into his staff, ensuring that he, too, had a Scipio on his side. However, in his haste to invade, he made a critical error. Unlike his usual meticulous planning, he rushed his departure. Bad weather scattered his fleet, and when he arrived on the shores of Africa, he found himself dangerously outnumbered with only 3,000 infantry and 150 cavalry. The enemy garrison at Hadrumetum was strong, and Numidian cavalry were already closing in. His soldiers, realizing the situation, murmured about his reckless decision. For once, his famed speed had backfired. Had he just doomed his entire campaign? The African landing, a gamble against fate. The sky darkened over the Mediterranean, an omen of the chaos to come. The waves, once calm, now rose like the hands of Neptune himself, threatening to consume the fleet. But Julius Caesar was not a man to be deterred by the whims of nature. He had made up his mind. Africa was the next battlefield, and nothing, not even the raging sea, would delay him any longer. His fleet set sail under the cover of winter's fury, a desperate attempt to outpace his enemies. Unlike his meticulously planned campaigns of the past, this invasion was rushed, almost reckless. The Pompeians had been strengthening their hold on Africa for over a year, gathering legions, elephants, and the infamous Numidian cavalry. Caesar knew time was against him. Yet, as his ships battled the storm, the very element he had defied turned against him. Winds scattered his fleet. The once cohesive invasion force was now fragmented, leaving some ships lost at sea and others landing at different points along the African coast. The result: a dangerously small vanguard stepping onto hostile shores. When the first of Caesar's warships reached land, only 3,000 infantry and a mere 150 cavalry had made it safely ashore. In contrast, the Pompeians had tens of thousands of troops, fortified cities, and supply lines firmly under their control. If the enemy struck now, Caesar's campaign would be over before it had even begun. Caesar's men disembarked onto the sands near Hadrumetum, a key coastal city under the command of Gaius Concilius Longus. The city was well defended, garrisoned by 10,000 men, both Romans and Numidian allies. Caesar, usually bold in his offensives, hesitated. He knew he lacked the manpower to storm the city, yet he also couldn't afford to waste time. Instead of an immediate attack, he attempted diplomacy. A messenger was sent to Concilius, offering terms. But before negotiations could even begin, the messenger was executed, his body unceremoniously dumped outside the city walls. A clear response: the Pompeians would show no mercy. Realizing that he had neither the numbers nor the resources for a siege, Caesar made the only choice he could: withdraw. But his retreat did not go unnoticed. As his forces moved away from the city, they were pursued. Numidian cavalry, moving like shadows across the landscape, began their deadly dance of harassment. Caesar's men, weighed down by their armor and marching in tight formations, found themselves unable to counter the swift and unpredictable attacks. The Numidians would charge, throw javelins, and disappear before the Romans could even react. It was a tactic perfected over generations, and against an unprepared force, it was devastating. The Numidians were not like the heavy cavalry of Rome or Gaul. They did not wear thick armor or charge in tightly packed formations. Instead, they relied on speed, agility, and precision. Their horses were small, but incredibly fast, able to cover great distances without tiring. Each rider carried multiple javelins, attacking in hit-and-run waves that whittled down their opponents without ever engaging in prolonged combat. For centuries, this style of warfare had confounded Rome. The great Hannibal Barca had used Numidian cavalry to crush the Romans at Cannae. And now, decades later, the same tactics were being used against Caesar. Caesar, however, was not one to panic. He had studied history and knew what needed to be done. Instead of attempting to chase down the cavalry, he ordered his men to form defensive squares, with shields locked and pila at the ready. His legions became mobile fortresses, slowly making their way inland while minimizing casualties. Yet, the battle was not just physical, it was psychological. The Numidians taunted the Romans, circling them like vultures, reminding them that they were outnumbered and far from home. Every Roman soldier knew the fate of Curio, one of Caesar's commanders who had been annihilated in Africa by the same enemy just a few years earlier. Would history repeat itself? After what felt like an eternity under constant attack, Caesar's force reached Ruspina, a small coastal settlement that he quickly fortified. Here, he would regroup and wait for the rest of his fleet to arrive. But the situation was dire. Supplies were scarce, and morale was dangerously low. His men whispered of their precarious situation, surrounded, outnumbered, and with no clear path forward. Despite this, Caesar remained unshaken. He knew that in war, perception was everything. Even in the most desperate of circumstances, he could not allow his men to see doubt in his eyes. He walked among them, speaking of their past victories, of how they had overcome worse odds before. His presence alone steadied their resolve. That the Pompeians were not finished. They were aware that Caesar was vulnerable, and instead of launching an all-out attack, they played a different game, one of attrition. The enemy cut off access to food supplies, forcing Caesar to send out foraging parties. But every attempt to gather provisions was met with swift and brutal ambushes by Numidian cavalry. Men who left camp often did not return. Starvation loomed over the camp like a specter, and the realization was clear. Caesar had walked into a carefully laid trap. Realizing that he needed to act before his men succumbed to hunger, Caesar gathered what forces he had and marched out on January 4th to secure food. He had roughly 15,000 men, far less than he had hoped for, but enough to put up a fight. His scouts soon returned with alarming news. A massive dust cloud was approaching in the distance, a clear sign of an advancing army. As the dust settled, the full scale of the threat became apparent. Facing Caesar was a vast Pompeian force, led by none other than Labienus, Caesar's former right-hand man who had defected to the enemy. Labienus was not just any general. He had fought alongside Caesar for years and knew his tactics better than anyone. And now, he was using that knowledge against him. The Pompeian forces vastly outnumbered Caesar's. With thousands of cavalry and skirmishers, they spread out in a crescent formation, surrounding the Romans on all sides. They did not charge immediately. Instead, they began the same relentless hit-and-run tactics that had plagued Caesar since his landing. It was a battle of attrition, one that Caesar could not afford to lose. The Battle of Ruspina, a desperate struggle for survival. The sun hung low over the barren plains of Africa, casting long shadows across the dry earth. The land stretched endlessly, broken only by scattered patches of scrub and the occasional rolling hill. In the distance, a faint haze shimmered, distorted by the relentless heat. At first, it seemed harmless, a trick of the light, perhaps, but as moments passed, the shimmer darkened, thickened, and grew. Doused, a massive cloud, rising into the sky like smoke from an unseen fire. It was the unmistakable sign of an approaching army. Caesar's scouts had seen it first. They had ridden hard back to camp, their horses lathered in sweat, their expressions grim. When they arrived, they wasted no time. An army was closing in. Fast. Caesar, standing at the edge of his makeshift camp, narrowed his eyes as he gazed toward the rising dust cloud. He had seen this before. He knew what it meant, but it was the next piece of news that sent a chill through him. Leading the enemy force was none other than Titus Labienus. For years, Labienus had been one of Caesar's most trusted generals. They had marched together, fought together, and bled together. He had been a brilliant strategist, a commander who understood the intricacies of battle as well as Caesar himself. But when the civil war had begun, Labienus had chosen to side with Pompey. Now, he stood against the man he had once served, determined to end Caesar's campaign before it could truly begin. And he had the perfect tools to do it. Labienus was not a man to rush blindly into battle. He knew how Caesar thought, how he fought, and, most importantly, what weaknesses he had. And here, in the dry, open fields of North Africa, those weaknesses would be exposed. His army was composed primarily of cavalry, thousands of Numidian horsemen, fast and relentless. Unlike traditional Roman cavalry, which fought in tight formations, the Numidians thrived on mobility. They struck quickly, throwing volleys of javelins before vanishing into the dust. They did not engage in prolonged combat. Instead, they bled their enemies dry, slowly, methodically, and mercilessly. Alongside them were skirmishers, light infantry trained to harass and weaken the enemy. And further back, waiting for the moment of final destruction, were elite heavy cavalry, Germanic and Gallic mercenaries, clad in thick armor, their massive horses bred for sheer force. They were the hammer to the Numidian anvil. Labienus positioned his forces in a long, stretched out line, designed to envelop Caesar's army. His cavalry fanned out, spreading across the horizon, ensuring there would be no escape. And then, with the patience of a predator, he gave the order to advance. The attack began not with a roar, but with a whisper, the faint whistling of javelins cutting through the air. Then came the thunder of hoofs. The Numidian cavalry swept in like a tide, their riders hurling javelins before wheeling away just as quickly. They never got close enough for the Romans to strike back. Every time a legionary attempted to chase them down, they would retreat beyond reach, only to return moments later from a different direction. Caesar's men tried to hold their ground, but the assault was relentless. Every Roman shield was soon embedded with javelins. Every soldier was forced to fight in all directions at once. There was no rest, no reprieve. Labienus, watching from a distance, smiled. He knew exactly what he was doing. This was not a battle. It was a slow execution. And then, to further break their spirits, he rode out in full view of the Roman lines. Removing his helmet, he let his soldiers see his face, his confidence. "Look at them," he called out, loud enough for the Romans to hear. "These are not the men who won at Pharsalus. These are war recruits, scarce and weak. Tell me, Romans, where is your great Caesar now?" The insult stung. It was meant to. And for a moment, the Roman lines wavered. But then, a single Roman soldier stepped forward, a veteran of the legendary 10th Legion. He had fought under Caesar for years. He had seen what the general could do, and he would not stand for this mockery. With a roar, he hurled his pylon. The javelin flew true, striking Labienus' horse square in the chest. The beast reared, screaming, before collapsing beneath him. The battlefield fell silent for a moment. Then, chaos. Labienus was pulled from the field, but the damage had been done. The morale of the Pompeian army faltered, if only slightly, and Caesar, ever the opportunist, seized the moment. Realizing that he could not win a prolonged engagement, Caesar made a bold decision. Instead of trying to break through the enemy lines in one direction, he did something no one expected. He split his army. Giving the order, he had every other cohort turn and fight in the opposite direction. His legions, despite their exhaustion, executed the maneuver flawlessly, forming two fronts, one pushing forward, the other covering their retreat. Labienus' forces hesitated. For the first time that day, they were uncertain. And in war, hesitation is death. With renewed determination, Caesar's men cut through the gaps in the enemy formation, breaking free from the encirclement. It was not a victory, but it was survival. And in that moment, survival was enough. When the dust settled, both armies withdrew. The Pompeians had inflicted heavy losses, but they had not delivered the final blow. Caesar had escaped, battered but alive. But he had learned something invaluable. This was not like his previous battles. The terrain, the tactics, the enemy, everything was different. If he wanted to win, he would have to adapt. He could no longer rely on brute force alone. As he looked across the battlefield, seeing his men exhausted but still standing, he knew one thing: the war was far from over. And this time, he would not make the same mistakes. The aftermath and Caesar's ultimate victory. The battle had ended, but its scars remained. The once proud legions of Caesar, who had marched victoriously across the known world, now found themselves battered, exhausted, and uncertain of their future. Their sandals sank into the African dust as they made their way back to camp, heads low, bodies aching from the relentless battle at Ruspina. Their supplies were dwindling, their stomachs empty. Some whispered that this campaign had been doomed from the start, that Caesar had underestimated the enemy and led them into a slow and painful death. The vast, open terrain of North Africa had turned against them, and now, with little food and an army still hunting them, They wonder how long they could last. But in the heart of the camp, amid the tattered banners and wounded soldiers, there stood one man who did not waver: Julius Caesar. He moved among his men, his expression unreadable. He did not scold them for their doubts, nor did he pretend the situation was anything less than dire. Instead, he spoke to them as he always had, with unwavering confidence. "We have been in worse situations before," he reminded them. "At Alesia, we were surrounded by an army twice our size, and we still won. At Pharsalus, we faced the great Pompey, and we still won. Here, in Africa, we will do the same." There was no magic in his words, only certainty. And certainty, in times of desperation, was the most powerful weapon of all. While Caesar and his men licked their wounds, the Pompeian leaders were rejoicing. To them, Ruspina had been the beginning of the end for Caesar. His army was starving, his numbers depleted, and his once great aura of invincibility shattered. Labienus, who had once served under Caesar, assured his fellow commanders that their former leader was now cornered. Soon, they believed, they would have him either dead or in chains. But this overconfidence would prove to be their undoing. Caesar was no stranger to adversity. His entire career had been defined by impossible odds and miraculous turnarounds. He knew that in war, perception was everything. His men could not be allowed to see themselves as the losers of Ruspina. If they believed they were doomed, they would be. The first step to recovery was simple: survival. He secured what little food he could from local villages, rationing supplies carefully. Foraging parties were sent out, but this time, with better coordination to avoid the Numidian ambushes. More importantly, he used this time to rebuild morale. He reminded his men of their training, organizing drills even in the midst of hardship. He addressed them daily, never letting their spirits fall too low. To be a soldier of Caesar was to be part of something greater than a single battle. And then, just as the situation reached its most desperate point, reinforcements arrived. Ships from Sicily finally reached Africa, bringing fresh troops and much-needed supplies. The sight of reinforcements landing on the shores lifted the spirits of the battered legions. But reinforcements alone would not win the war. Caesar had learned from his mistakes at Ruspina. He could no longer fight a conventional battle against an enemy that excelled in speed and mobility. Instead, he adapted. The Numidian cavalry had thrived on open engagements where they could harass Roman infantry at will. So Caesar changed the rules. He ordered his men to fight in tighter, more disciplined formations, reducing the gaps the Numidians could exploit. He used ambush tactics of his own, forcing the enemy into terrain where their cavalry advantage was nullified. He turned the tables by denying them the ability to dictate the terms of battle. It was not a fast process, but it was effective. Step by step, battle by battle, Caesar began to regain the initiative. The final blow came at Thapsus. By now, Caesar had regained full control of his forces and was ready for a decisive engagement. The Pompeians, believing they still held the upper hand, met him in battle. But this time, the story was different. Caesar's legions, once hesitant against Numidian tactics, now fought with precision. His cavalry, reinforced and retrained, countered the Numidians effectively. And most importantly, his men fought with the knowledge that they had overcome the worst, that this was the moment they would turn the tide for good. Thapsus was a slaughter. The Pompeian forces, despite their numbers, crumbled under the discipline and sheer force of Caesar's army. The war in Africa was effectively over. Cato, the moral backbone of the Pompeian cause, chose suicide over capture, and the last remnants of the opposition fled. Caesar had won. The war in Africa had been unlike any other Caesar had fought. It had tested him not just as a general, but as a leader. More than any other campaign, it had shown the importance of adaptability, of understanding when to change tactics, when to fight, and when to retreat. It had also revealed the limits of his invincibility. For the first time, Caesar had been outmaneuvered, outmatched, and nearly destroyed. But he had survived, and in doing so, he had ensured that his legend would continue. Had he lost, the consequences would have been unimaginable. Rome would have fallen back into the hands of the Pompeians, and the entire course of history would have changed. The empire we know today might never have existed. But victory in Africa was not the end of Caesar's journey. In many ways, it was only the beginning of the end. His triumphs would lead him back to Rome, back to the Senate, and ultimately, back to the Ides of March. The lessons he had learned in Africa, the ability to adapt, to outthink his enemies, to command absolute loyalty, would serve him well in his final days. But not even Caesar, with all his brilliance, could escape the fate that awaited him in Rome. And perhaps, deep down, he knew it. For as he once said, "It is not these well-fed, long-haired men that I fear, but the pale and the hungry-looking." Caesar's campaign in Africa was one of his most challenging, yet it showcased the essence of his leadership. It was a campaign of hardship, resilience, and adaptation. More than just a military victory, it solidified his position as Rome's greatest commander. The lessons from Africa would be studied for centuries. Military leaders, from Napoleon to modern strategists, would look to his ability to overcome adversity as a blueprint for success. But for Caesar, there would be no time to bask in his triumph. Rome awaited, and with it, the final chapter of his life. Caesar had conquered Africa. Now, he would return home. But was Rome truly his? Or was it already slipping through his fingers?